Welcome back. I'm Timothy, and today we're looking beyond the beauty of America's favorite national park to uncover Yellowstone's deadliest hot spring disasters. From a man who slid into 158-degree superheated water to another who got attacked by something invisible underground. It was August 18, 2019, at Midway Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, and the park was busy the way it always is in late summer. Dexan Wolf was 29 years old and worked as a salesman for a tissue manufacturing company, spending most of his week driving between supermarkets and wholesale stores across several states. He had met his wife Brenly 4 years earlier, and they had married after saving for a simple wedding. Neither of them wanted an expensive honeymoon. They chose Yellowstone because it was where they had taken one of their favorite trips while dating, and going back felt right. Dexan had one idea he could not stop talking about in the weeks before the trip. He had found an old photograph online showing a couple standing close to a steaming geothermal pool with no other visitors in the frame. He wanted that exact shot for their living room. He showed it to Brenly more than once and described exactly how it would look. I think most of us have had a version of that feeling, seeing a photograph and wanting to put yourself inside it. The difference is usually just how far someone is willing to go to get there. When they arrived at the park and found the area surrounded by new warning signs and a boardwalk that kept visitors well back from the pools, Brenly told him they could take the picture from the path and remove other people in editing later. Dexan shook his head. He wanted the picture to be real. They had taken a 5-hour flight to get there, and he was not leaving without the shot he had imagined. He waited until a group of visitors moved farther down the boardwalk and then stepped off the path. It was only a few steps. The ground looked dry and solid and gave no indication of what was underneath it. The National Park Service requires visitors to stay on the boardwalk because the ground can appear completely solid while hiding superheated water beneath a thin mineral crust. Dexan moved 2 steps off the boardwalk toward the spot he had chosen when the ground suddenly gave way beneath him. He crashed through the thin crust into a concealed channel of superheated geothermal water. The water was approximately 158 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, serious burn damage begins in under a second, and full-thickness burns can develop within 2 to 3 seconds of contact. The water saturated his clothing immediately, and the heat transferred across his lower body and legs before Brenly could reach him. From the edge of the boardwalk, Brenly managed to grab him and pull him free within seconds. Even so, the exposure had already caused severe burns across roughly 30% of his body, concentrated on his legs, lower back, and hands where he had pushed against the channel walls trying to climb out. Brenly pulled him out within seconds. That is not slow. That is as fast as any person could move. And it was still too late to change what had already happened to his body in those seconds. He was conscious when park staff reached them, and emergency services were contacted immediately. He was airlifted to a regional burn center where specialists began treatment. The burns were deep and covered enough surface area that the risk of infection and systemic complications was significant from the first day. Doctors worked to manage both over the following week, but the burn injuries led to infection that progressed into organ failure despite aggressive treatment. Dexan died 8 days after the incident. Investigators confirmed he had stepped off the boardwalk voluntarily and that the warning signs and barriers in the area had been clearly visible. The ground failure was consistent with the known geology of that section of the park. His camera was recovered and returned to Brenly. It contained dozens of photographs from earlier that day taken on the boardwalk and around the park. The last ones showed the steam rising from the pools and the spot he had been trying to reach. Brenly went home with a camera full of photographs from a day that started as a honeymoon and became something else entirely. I sit with that every time I come back to this case. The picture he wanted was never taken. Dexan stepped off the path chasing an image he had been picturing for weeks. What happened at Midway Geyser Basin 2 years earlier started from a completely different place, with a young man who had already decided that ordinary footage was never going to be enough. It was July 11th, 2017, at Midway Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, and the basin was still quiet when they arrived. Cody Blevins was 24 years old and had been working as a delivery driver until a few weeks earlier when a dispute with his manager over a tampered package ended with him walking out mid-shift. He told his friends he was done working for other people and was going to build a social media channel instead. For the following weeks, he posted parkour videos almost every day, jumping benches, rails, and stair sets around his hometown, spending hours editing each clip and checking the view count. Most videos reached a few hundred views and stopped. The slow growth frustrated him, and he became convinced he needed something that looked like nowhere else. He found Midway Geyser Basin online and decided that was it. His girlfriend Presley had heard the idea before they left and had told him clearly that visitors were required to stay on the boardwalk because the ground surrounding the hot springs conceals near boiling water beneath a thin mineral crust that can look completely solid. She suggested filming somewhere else in the park. Cody told her nobody would watch an ordinary video, and that was the end of the conversation. I have seen this exact logic play out in so many of these cases. The belief that risk is what makes content worth watching. And sometimes it works, right up until it does not. They arrived early and the basin was nearly empty. Cody handed Presley his phone and asked her to record. He backed up on the boardwalk, took a running start, cleared the safety rail, and landed on the ground beside the path. The surface held. He jumped back onto the boardwalk and turned around smiling. He told Presley the second jump would look better because he now knew exactly how much speed he needed. She told him to leave it alone, but he backed up again. That first landing is the moment that sealed everything. Nothing bad happened, so he treated it as proof that nothing bad could happen. I have watched that same logic destroy people in case after case. The geothermal ground around Midway Geyser Basin is covered by a thin mineral crust that can hide extremely hot water beneath the surface. Because weak spots cannot be identified by sight, visitors are required to stay on the boardwalk. Cody took another running start and jumped. His first foot landed safely, but his second came down on a section of crust that instantly collapsed beneath him. The ground broke away without warning, leaving him waist-deep in a concealed geothermal pool as he desperately clawed at the crumbling edge, searching for anything to hold on to. Presley dropped the phone and instinctively jumped off the boardwalk. Ignoring the shouts behind her, she rushed to the edge and reached for him. Cody grabbed both of her arms as she tried to pull him free, but his weight shifted onto the already fragile ground beneath her. The crust cracked again and collapsed, sending both of them into the superheated water below. Other visitors rushed toward the railing but stopped as the surrounding ground continued breaking apart. The collapse spread several feet beyond the original opening, making it impossible for anyone to reach the couple without risking the same fate. Rangers were called immediately as witnesses could only watch from the boardwalk. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the unstable geothermal ground made any rescue attempt impossible until the area could be secured. By the time specialized crews were able to approach, both Cody Blevins and Presley had succumbed to catastrophic thermal injuries sustained during the collapse. Investigators later determined that the initial collapse had destabilized the surrounding crust, causing the second failure when Presley attempted to help him. Rangers later recovered Cody's phone from the boardwalk where Presley had dropped it moments before running to him. The recording ended the instant the first section of ground gave way. He had quit his job a few weeks before this trip, believing one good video could change his life. I understand that hope. I just wish this had not been the place he chose to chase it. What happened at Wes Thumb the following year is the one in this video that I find genuinely hardest to sit with, because the man who went into that water did it to pull someone else out. It was October 5, 2018, at Wes Thumb Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park, and the afternoon light was sitting low across the water. Keldron Osk was 33 years old and worked as an auto parts salesman at a dealership in Colorado. The previous year had taken most of what had been stable in his life and dismantled it within a few months. A long-term relationship ended. He fell behind on rent and lost his apartment, and his father died after a short illness. Friends noticed he had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual self. He spent several months in counseling and came out of it with one decision he had made himself. He was going to stop letting fear keep him from trying things. The solo trip to Yellowstone was the first thing he had booked for himself in years. I think that decision to stop letting fear run things is one of the healthiest things a person can arrive at after a year like his. The tragedy is in how that exact decision got applied in this specific moment. He had been exploring West Thumb for nearly an hour when he heard shouting farther down the boardwalk. A young visitor had leaned over the railing to take a photograph, slipped, and fallen into a small boiling spring beside the walkway. The victim screamed and struggled to stay above the water while nearby tourists froze in shock. Several people shouted for help, but no one could safely reach the spring from the boardwalk. Without hesitating, Keldron climbed over the railing and rushed toward the spring. Other visitors yelled for him to stop, warning that the ground was unstable, but he ignored them. He reached the victim and, despite the intense heat, managed to push them toward the edge, where several bystanders grabbed hold and pulled them back onto the boardwalk. As Keldron tried to climb out himself, the thin ground beneath him collapsed. One of his legs became trapped against the edge of the spring while boiling water continued surging around him. Every attempt to free himself only made the unstable ground crumble farther. People were shouting for him to stop, and he climbed over anyway. I think about how many of us would like to believe we would do the same thing in that moment. I genuinely do not know if I would. People could see him only a few feet away, but no one could safely reach him without risking the same fate. Park rangers and emergency crews arrived within minutes and used specialized equipment to pull him free after securing the unstable ground. By then, he had suffered catastrophic burns from the prolonged exposure. Doctors found severe thermal burns across much of his body, along with extensive airway damage caused by inhaling superheated steam. Despite multiple surgeries and intensive care, his condition continued to worsen. 3 days later, Keldron Osk died from complications of extensive thermal burns, inhalation injuries, and resulting multiple organ failure. The young visitor he had rescued survived after receiving treatment for burns to the lower body and was discharged from the hospital several weeks later. Investigators concluded the accident began when the visitor leaned beyond the boardwalk railing to take a photograph, lost their balance, and slipped into the boiling spring. Keldron entered the thermal area voluntarily in an attempt to save them. His family later said they were heartbroken but proud that his final decision had been to save another person's life. Park officials used the incident during future safety briefings, reminding visitors that even well-intentioned rescue attempts inside Yellowstone's thermal areas can quickly create additional victims. He went into that spring to save someone else. The person he pulled out survived. I think about that trade every time I read this case, and I still do not know what to do with it. What happened to the next person at that same basin is quieter than everything before it in this video. She came to Yellowstone to keep a promise she and her son had made to each other. It was March 30th, 2020, at West Thumb Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. The afternoon was clear, and dozens of visitors walked the boardwalks viewing the hot springs and geysers. Petra Vulcan was 44 years old and had come to Yellowstone alone. A year earlier, she had lost her only son after a long illness. Before he became sick, they spent evenings planning a trip to Yellowstone. They circled places on a park map, watched travel videos, and promised each other they would see the hot springs one day. After he died, Petra could not bring herself to cancel the trip. She decided to go alone on the first anniversary of his death because she wanted to see the places they had talked about for so long. I think grief does something particular to how people move through the world. You go to the places you were supposed to share because being there feels like the closest thing left to being there with them. She joined a guided tour through the park. Petra listened carefully as the ranger explained the history of each stop. When the group reached West Thumb Geyser Basin, the ranger pointed toward Black Pool and explained that it had once looked much darker. Years ago, increased geothermal heat raised the water's temperature, killing the tiny microorganisms that gave the pool its dark color. As they disappeared, the water became much clearer. Petra loved stories like that. She stayed behind for a few extra moments while the rest of the group slowly continued along the boardwalk. Looking at the clear blue water, she imagined telling her son everything the ranger had just explained. A faint rumble echoed somewhere beneath the basin. A few nearby visitors glanced around before returning to their conversations. Nothing looked unusual. Without warning, a hydrothermal feature several yards from the boardwalk violently erupted. A column of boiling water, mud, rocks, and steam blasted into the air as underground pressure suddenly released, sending scalding debris across the surrounding viewing area. Petra, who had remained behind after the rest of her tour group had continued along the boardwalk, was closest to the eruption. She was struck by the force of the blast before fragments of rock and scalding debris rained down around her. Other visitors were knocked to the ground or suffered minor burns and injuries as people ran in every direction. Rangers immediately evacuated the basin while emergency crews rushed to the scene. Petra had suffered catastrophic impact injuries along with extensive burns caused by the boiling water and steam. She was airlifted to a regional trauma and burn center, but despite intensive treatment, her condition continued to deteriorate. Doctors determined that the combination of severe blunt force trauma, extensive thermal burns, and resulting multiple organ failure was unsurvivable. Petra Vulcan died 2 days later. Investigators concluded that Petra had simply been standing in the worst possible location when the explosion occurred. Several other visitors were treated for minor injuries and later released. Park officials temporarily closed the affected section of West Thumb Geyser Basin, while geologists assessed the damaged thermal feature before reopening the area. She came to keep a promise she and her son had made together while he was still alive. She never made it home. Her husband never visited West Thumb Geyser Basin. I think he probably never will. What happened to the next victim in this video started with his brother handing him a flat rock and a $20 dare. It was January 27, 2021, at Biscuit Basin in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. The afternoon was warm and clear as families walked the boardwalks, viewing the steaming pools and colorful ground. Wes Callahan was 22 years old and had come to Yellowstone with his family for a vacation before his younger brother left for college. Wes and his 19-year-old brother, Denny, had always been close. They grew up fishing, swimming in old quarries, climbing trees, and turning almost everything into a friendly competition. If one of them said something could not be done, the other usually tried it. Their parents often told them they would one day get themselves into trouble chasing silly dares. The brothers only laughed because every bad idea they had tried before ended with little more than scraped knees or funny stories. A few years earlier, Wes had slipped from a wet rock during a camping trip. He landed hard, bruised his ribs, and scared everyone for a few moments. After a visit to the hospital, he walked away with nothing serious. For years, the family joked about it during holidays. Wes often said people worried too much and that he always landed on his feet. The close call gave him confidence that things usually worked out in the end. I want to say something about that kind of confidence directly. Surviving a close call does not mean the next one will resolve the same way. It just means you were lucky once. Those are two very different things. The Yellowstone trip was meant to be a happy family vacation before Denny left for college later that year. Their parents wanted one last trip with both sons living under the same roof. They spent several days visiting different parts of the park, taking photos, watching wildlife, and laughing about old memories. When they reached Biscuit Basin, they stopped to admire the steaming pools and colorful ground. The family stayed on the boardwalk while looking around. Denny picked up a small flat rock and handed it to Wes. He joked that he would give Wes $20 if he could skip it across that pool. It sounded like the kind of challenge they had made hundreds of times before. Wes accepted. He said he only needed to get a little closer for a better angle. He climbed off the boardwalk and walked toward a shallow, bowl-shaped depression beside the thermal area. It looked harmless, with only a few wisps of steam drifting across the ground. As he bent down to line up his throw, he suddenly became lightheaded. He tried to stand but stumbled and collapsed into the hollow without saying a word. Some geothermal depressions can collect invisible gases released from underground. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide are both heavier than air, allowing them to settle close to the ground when there is little wind. In low-lying areas, these gases can displace oxygen, causing a person to become disoriented and rapidly lose consciousness without realizing they are in danger. Denny jumped off the boardwalk and ran toward his brother, but their father shouted for him to stop after noticing Wes was no longer moving. A nearby ranger recognized the danger and ordered everyone back while calling for emergency responders with protective breathing equipment. By the time rescuers safely entered the depression and pulled Wes out, he was no longer breathing. His parents were standing right there on the boardwalk when it happened. They had been watching. There was nothing they could do. I think about what that does to a parent, and I do not have a word for it. Paramedics attempted to revive Wes before airlifting him to a nearby hospital. Although his heart was briefly restarted, doctors determined he had suffered severe oxygen deprivation after inhaling concentrated geothermal gases. Despite intensive care, his condition progressed to irreversible brain injury and multiple organ failure. Wes died the following day. Nobody in the family ever spoke about the $20 dare again. I think that is the kind of silence that says more than anything they could have put into words. After the funeral, Denny folded the $20 bill and placed it inside his wallet. He never spent it. The last case I want to cover today is about a man who spent 11 years giving the exact warning that could have saved his own life. It was December 9th, 2022, at Norris Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. The morning was clear as steam drifted across the boardwalk and patches of fresh snow-covered parts of the thermal ground. Kellen Vickers was 58 years old and had spent almost 30 years as a firefighter before retiring. His son Theron was 17 years old and had been away at boarding school for most of the year. Kellen missed him more than he admitted. They spoke on the phone every week, but it was never the same as being together. Theron had always loved listening to his father's stories about geysers, hot springs, and wildlife. He promised that when school finished for the summer, he wanted to see the park for himself. A few days after Theron came home, he asked his father if they could spend one day together at work before school started again. It was something Kellen had quietly been hoping he would ask, a son asking his father if he could come see him at work. That one detail tells me everything about the relationship those two had. Most people thought Kellen would finally slow down after retirement, but he said he was not ready for that. He missed helping people every day, so he applied to work at Yellowstone. Over the next 11 years, he became one of the rangers visitors remembered. He enjoyed answering questions, telling stories about the park, and reminding people that the most beautiful places in Yellowstone could also be the most dangerous. He gave the same warning almost every day. Stay on the boardwalk. Never trust the ground. The earth beneath your feet may look solid, but it can be paper thin. He believed every word he said. After thousands of days without a serious accident, Kellen slowly became more comfortable around the thermal areas than he should have. He never ignored the danger on purpose. He simply started believing experience would protect him. He had walked the same routes so many times that they felt almost as familiar as the streets near his own house. I have seen this happen in every kind of dangerous work. The longer nothing goes wrong, the harder it becomes to keep treating the danger as real. Familiarity does not reduce the risk. It just makes the risk easier to forget. They arrived early that morning as steam drifted across the boardwalk and visitors gathered to watch the geysers. Kellen greeted several rangers and stopped to answer a few questions from curious visitors who recognized him from his talks. Theron stayed close behind, seeing how much his father loved the job. For the next hour, Kellen showed Theron the different geothermal features throughout the basin, explaining how each one worked. Farther along the boardwalk, Kellen noticed patches of fresh snow covering parts of the thermal ground. A nearby warning sign reminded visitors that snow could hide unstable geothermal areas beneath the surface. He had read the same warning countless times over the years and barely gave it another thought. As they reached another section of the boardwalk, Kellen noticed what looked like a safe, snow-covered patch beside the trail. He paused for a moment, studying the ground through the drifting steam. It looked no different from dozens of places he had walked past over the years. Wanting a slightly better view of the basin to show Theron, he stepped off the boardwalk. His first step held. Encouraged, he shifted his weight forward and took another. The hidden crust shattered beneath him. He plunged waist-deep into boiling geothermal mud that instantly trapped his legs. The thick mud clung to him as he struggled to pull free, but every movement only pulled him deeper. Theron lunged forward and grabbed both of his father's arms. The heat burned through his gloves and into his hands, but he refused to let go. Other visitors rushed over and helped pull, while another ranger warned them not to step off the boardwalk. After several desperate seconds, they managed to drag Kellen free, leaving one of his boots buried in the boiling mud. Someone immediately called emergency services as other rangers rushed to the scene and quickly realized how badly Kellen had been injured. A helicopter flew him to a regional burn center. Doctors found catastrophic burns across much of his lower body. Burn specialists worked around the clock, performing emergency surgery and giving him every treatment available. His family stayed at the hospital every day hoping for better news. For a short time, they believed he might survive. Then complications began. Infection developed despite treatment, and his organs gradually started to fail. Several days later, Kellen Vickers died from complications of his injuries. Theron's hands eventually healed, but the scars never disappeared. Even years later, he still wore gloves because the damaged skin remained painful in both hot and cold weather. Theron burned his own hands, refusing to let go of his father. He was 17 years old. I do not know how a person carries something like that forward into the rest of their life. Kellen had spent years warning strangers never to step off the boardwalk. The only day he forgot his own advice was the day his son had finally come to see the place he loved most.